They tried to destroy Earth, but the truth still stood. The relay station was burning when I started talking. Not the kind of burning you plan for. Not a controlled demolition or a tactical retreat. The East Tower had taken a direct hit 11 minutes ago, and the fire was eating through the insulation in the walls, and I could smell it. That specific smell of burning wire and melted plastic that no training prepares you for, because no trainer wants to admit how often it ends this way. My name is Yara Osei. I was 34 years old. I was a commander in what used to be the Earth Lunar Defense Corps, which was a very important title for an organization that no longer had a planet to defend. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest. I am not a hero. Heroes are people who do extraordinary things because they believe extraordinary things are possible. I did what I did because the alternative was letting everything that ever mattered get swallowed by a silence so complete it would be as if we had never existed at all. That is a different kind of motivation. It is quieter. It is, I think, more dangerous. The broadcast array was still functional. Barely. One of the secondary transmitters had buckled in the shockwave from the first drone strike, and the primary dish was running on backup power that I was stealing from the life support system in the East Corridor, which meant the East Corridor was currently very cold and also on fire, which is a combination of problems I did not have a protocol for. I sat in front of the transmitter panel, and I began to talk. Not about the war, not about the Vorath Collective or their ships, or the 8 months they had spent methodically removing every trace of human civilization from the galactic record. I had maybe 4 hours of power left, possibly less if the fire moved faster than I expected, and I had made a decision about how to use that time that would have seemed completely irrational to anyone who was not me. I talked about my mother's kitchen. Specifically, I talked about the smell of it on a Sunday morning. The groundnut soup that took 3 hours and filled the entire flat with something so warm and specific that even now, sitting in a burning relay station on the moon with my last 4 hours ticking down, I could reconstruct it completely. The exact weight of that smell, the way it meant safety before I knew what safety needed to be protected from. I talked about Lagos traffic at 2 in the morning, which is not like traffic anywhere else because it has its own sound, its own rhythm, almost like breathing. I talked about the specific gray of London in November, which is different from the gray of any other November in any other city. And I know that sounds like something a person says who has not seen other cities, but I have seen other cities. And I am telling you, London in November is its own particular shade of gray that I have not found a name for. I talked about football stadiums. I had a digital archive loaded into the transmitter, 4.7 terabytes of human record that I had spent 11 months collecting and compressing and encrypting. Military intelligence, government documents, population records, the things you would expect. But also, recipe collections posted on websites that no longer existed, argument threads about whether a certain film was better than people remembered, a grandfather in New Zealand teaching his granddaughter to drive. The video, 43 minutes long, mostly just him saying, "Gently, gently," and her laughing every time the car lurched. The Vorath had made a very specific kind of mistake. They had built their erasure strategy around what they believed human civilization was: infrastructure, military command structures, government records, communication networks. They came in systematically and they dismantled all of it, and they were thorough and they were efficient, and by every measure that they understood, they succeeded. They did not account for the fact that humans had spent 30 years before first contact doing something no other species in the galactic record had ever done. We had digitized our arguments. We had uploaded our grocery lists, and our birthday messages, and our very bad poems about lost relationships, and our 47-minute videos of learning to drive. We had taken the texture of ordinary life and scattered it across 1,000 servers, and backup drives, and cloud platforms with names like Cheerful Nonsense. The Vorath erased our data centers, our government archives, our military communications. They did not know what Reddit was. I am not saying that lightly. I am saying that an empire sophisticated enough to rewrite galactic history across 400 years of recorded contact had no framework for a species that backed up its civilization in comment sections. The drone circling outside made another pass. I watched the sensor reading flicker across the screen. It was scanning for active life signs, not transmissions. A small mercy, or a small oversight. With the Vorath, it was sometimes hard to tell the difference. I kept talking. I described the specific noise a crowded train makes, that compressed human sound of everyone pretending they are not standing close enough to feel each other breathing. I described the way snow looks at 3 in the morning, when there is no one else on the street, and every footstep sounds like a decision. I described what it felt like to sit in a stadium with 60,000 people and have all 60,000 of them make the same noise at the same moment. Not a planned noise, not a coordinated noise, but the involuntary sound of 60,000 people feeling the same thing at the same second. I described my mother's voice. I had a recording of it. I played it into the transmitter, 12 seconds of her saying my name on a birthday, the specific way she said it, with the emphasis just slightly different from how anyone else ever said it, and I let it go out into the signal, and I did not explain what it was, or why I had included it, because the only person who needed to understand it was me, and I already understood it completely. There was a moment, somewhere in the 3rd hour, when I realized I was crying. This surprised me. I had been dry for a long time. Not numb exactly, just used up in the specific way that happens when you have spent 11 months being the last person responsible for something irreplaceable. The tear surprised me more than the drone strike that took out the East Tower. I wiped it off the console and kept talking. The fire was closer. I could feel it in the air now, that particular warmth that has nothing to do with comfort. The backup power readout showed 38 minutes left. I had covered most of what I needed to cover. The archive was loaded, encrypted, packaged into the quantum capsule sitting in the launch tube behind me, waiting for the signal I would send when I was done. I thought about what to say last. I had prepared something. An official statement, a record of what had happened, who was responsible, what the galactic community should understand about the Vorath Collective, and their 400 years of practiced erasure. It was precise, and documented, and completely correct. I did not send it last. What I sent last was a 6-year-old's drawing of a dog. I had found it in the archive, uploaded from a family drive by a woman in Ohio, who had been scanning old papers, and posted them with the caption, "Found this in my mom's attic. She drew this when she was little. I am not okay." The drawing was in crayon, unsteady lines, the dog more or less circular, and at the bottom in large, careful letters, "Mr. Woofington, the best dog, circa now. Circa now." I do not know why that child wrote circa now on a drawing she made when she was 6. I do not know if she heard the phrase somewhere and liked the sound of it, or if she genuinely understood what it meant in some way that 6-year-olds sometimes understand things that adults have forgotten. But I know that when I found it in the archive, I held it on my screen for a long time. And I know that when I was deciding what to send last, before the power ran out, and the fire closed in, and the last human relay station on the lunar surface went quiet, I chose that, circa now, because that is what I was trying to say. Not in the past, not in memory. Now, still now. We are still here even in the moment of our not being here, and the best dog, and the crayon lines, and the woman who was not okay finding it in her mother's attic, and my grandmother's kitchen on Sunday, and the grey of London in November, all of it. Now. I launched the capsule. The launch was quiet. These things always are. A soft displacement of air, and then nothing. Just the tracking signal, showing it moving away from the station at the angle I had calculated, the trajectory that would take it toward the last known coordinates of the Threnodi Deep Space Research Station, 17 months away at standard drift. 17 months was a long time. I stood up from the console and turned around to begin the process of figuring out what to do next, which mostly involved not being in a burning building, and I saw something that stopped me completely. There was another capsule in the secondary launch tube. Not mine. Not anything I had loaded. It was older than mine, the casing a slightly different grade of material, and the transmitter log showed it had been sitting there for a very long time, far longer than the 11 months I had been stationed here. It was already launched, the tube empty, but the tracking signal was still active. Someone had already sent a capsule before me. I did not know who. I did not know when. I did not know what was in it. I knew one thing. I was not the last. I had never been the last. There was already a message in the dark, already moving, already carrying whatever it carried toward wherever it was going, and I had not known about it, and it had not known about me, and we had both been out here in the quiet, doing the same thing in the same silence, without any knowledge of each other. I sat back down. The fire was very close now. I could hear it, that specific sound of something being consumed that cannot be unconsumed. I pulled up the tracking data on the older capsule, and I did not understand most of what I was reading, because the origin codes were Threnodi, not human. Someone from the Threnodi had sent a message to us before we sent one to them. I sat there with the fire getting closer, and the backup power at 4 minutes, and the relay station groaning around me, and I thought about that. A Threnodi capsule, sent to Earth, before the war, already in the dark, already moving in the opposite direction from mine, 2 messages crossing in the nothing between stars, like letters sent before the phone lines went down. 3 minutes of power. I copied the tracking data onto a personal drive and put it in my pocket. Then I got out of the burning building. I am going to tell you something about the Threnodi that will help you understand what happened next. They are not, as a species, naturally inclined toward risk. They are archivists by culture and by temperament. They catalog, they preserve, they maintain records with a thoroughness that most species find admirable, and some species find maddening, because the Threnodi have been known to spend 2 years documenting a minor border dispute that everyone else resolved and forgot in a week. What I did not know, in the burning relay station, was that a Threnodi xenoarchivist named Owen Graves had been carrying a very specific weight for 17 months. I learned the details later. Owen told me himself. Eventually, in the careful way he had of reconstructing events chronologically, even when the chronology was uncomfortable for him. I will tell you his part of the story the way he told it to me, which means I will not be entirely fair about it, because there are things he did and did not do that I have not entirely made peace with, and I believe that a person telling a story should tell you when they are not being entirely fair, rather than pretending to an objectivity they do not possess. Owen Graves was 41 years old, Threnodi standard age, which made him relatively young for a senior archivist. He had spent 15 years in the Threnodi Deep Space Cultural Research Program, a program that most of his government considered mildly eccentric and fully non-essential. His specific specialization was pre-contact civilization documentation, which meant that before any species in the galactic community officially encountered a new intelligent life form, Owen and his team would spend years quietly studying them from a distance, archiving what they found, building a record. He had been assigned to Earth 12 years before the Vorath arrived. He had spent those 12 years learning everything about us that could be learned from a safe observational distance: language patterns, cultural structures, the way our media worked, which confused him enormously for the first 3 years, the way our governments worked, which confused him for the remaining 9. He had catalogued our music and our architecture and our sporting events and our religious practices and our peculiar habit of holding extremely strong opinions about things that had no measurable effect on our survival as a species. He had a copy of Earth. Not complete, not everything, but 17 months of pre-contact archival work, covering culture and language and daily life, in a breadth that no one else in the galaxy possessed, because no one else in the galaxy had been quietly watching us for 12 years, before we knew we were being watched. When the Vorath arrived, Owen's program was classified, his archive was sealed, his government voted, in the emergency session that lasted 47 hours, to accept the Vorath's version of events, and not intervene. Owen was not in that session. He found out about the vote through an internal memo. He told me he read the memo 3 times. Then he went to his office and sat at his desk for 6 hours without moving. Then he went home. Then he came back the next morning and began, very quietly, to do something his government had told him he was not allowed to do. He began to organize the archive. Not to release it, not yet. He did not have a plan, in the beginning. He had a feeling, which was unusual for Owen, who had spent most of his career operating in the territory of documented fact, rather than instinct. The feeling was this, that what he had in his archive was not simply an academic record, it was evidence. And evidence, in his professional understanding, did not become less true because the people in power had decided not to look at it. He sent the capsule to the lunar relay station, 6 months after the Vorath moved on Earth. He had no way of knowing if anyone would be there to receive it. He sent it anyway. The capsule contained a message, one message, in 11 human languages, and the message was, "We know you existed." That is all it said. We know you existed. Owen Graves, Senior Xeno-Archivist, Threnody Deep Space Research Program, in 11 languages, so that whoever found it would find it in their own words. He told his supervisor he had sent it. His supervisor told him to document the transmission and never speak of it again. Owen documented the transmission. Then he went back to organizing the archive, more carefully this time, because he had begun to understand what he was actually building. The moment my capsule arrived was not dramatic, in the way he told it. He was eating something at his desk, reviewing a translation index, when the alert came through that an incoming signal had been received and flagged for his attention. He almost did not open it immediately. He had 17 months of practice not opening things that would complicate his life. He opened it. The first file was a recipe. His translation system processed it and presented it to him as a list of ingredients and instructions for something called groundnut soup, with a handwritten note at the bottom of the scan that said, "Mum's version, better than any recipe." He read it twice. The translation was accurate, but he did not think the translation was the point. The second file was an argument. He had seen human arguments before, in his 12 years of archival work, but this one was different from the ones he had catalogued in pre-contact observations. This was an argument between two people about which of two films was better, and the argument was 17 pages long, and both people were completely wrong about everything, and at the end of it both people said goodbye to each other, in a way that made it clear they had been arguing like this for years, and would continue to do so, and found genuine enjoyment in the process. Owen told me he sat with that file for a long time. He had spent his career in a culture where disagreement was documented, and filed and resolved through established procedures. The Threnody did not argue for pleasure. They did not maintain positions they knew to be incorrect simply because the act of defending them was satisfying. The idea of spending 17 pages disagreeing with someone you liked about something that did not matter, and finding it worthwhile enough to do again the next week, was not a concept his cultural framework had a place for. He moved through the archive slowly. He was systematic because he was Owen, because he could not be unsystematic even when he was doing something his government had classified. He cataloged what he found. He built a secondary index. He cross-referenced it with his pre-contact archive, 12 years of his own documentation, and he noted the overlap and the gaps and the things that surprised him. The things that surprised him were not what you might expect. He expected the official records to surprise him, the government documents, the military communications, the emergency protocols from the final months. These were the records he had assumed would be the heart of the capsule. They were a small fraction of it. The largest single category in the archive, when he finished his index, was not political or military or diplomatic. It was personal. Messages between people who knew each other. Notes and photographs and recordings and small objects digitized by people who were not thinking about history when they digitized them, who were thinking about a birthday or a Wednesday afternoon, or a dog named Mr. Woofington. The weight of the archive was not in its official content. It was in its texture, the grain of daily life carried forward by people who did not know they were preserving anything. The Vorath had been correct that they erased human history. They had not understood that what they were erasing and what humans had actually preserved were two different things. Owen brought the archive to his superior on a Tuesday. His superior, a woman named Senior Director Petra Halloway, looked at him the way people look at someone they have been expecting to cause problems. She told him to destroy it. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to walk back to his office. He did not destroy it. Instead, he sent a message to the one contact he had inside the Galactic Council administrative offices, a contact he had never used and had hoped never to need, and he said 3 things. He said, "I have the human archive." He said, "I have 12 years of pre-contact documentation that contradicts the official Vorath account." He said, "I need to know if there is someone on that council who is not entirely satisfied with the way this story has been told." The response came back in 4 hours. It said, "There are 47 votes on this council, and 39 of them have not asked any questions, and 8 of them have been asking questions quietly for 16 months, and you should contact the following person." Owen read the name 3 times. Then he read my tracking data, which he had maintained since sending his capsule, and he realized my capsule had arrived at the lunar station approximately 3 weeks after he sent his message. He had my transmitter code. He had my frequency signature. He knew I was alive. He had known for 3 weeks, and had not told me because he did not know how to do it without compromising the position of the 8 council members who were waiting for evidence. And the evidence was the archive, and the archive needed to be presented correctly, or the Vorath would have it suppressed before it was seen. He told me all of this later. He was very precise about the reasoning. He explained each step in the logical chain with the careful thoroughness of someone who has spent a career documenting things that are difficult to document. I listened to all of it. Then I told him that the next time he knew I was alive, he should tell me. He wrote that down. I do not know why he wrote it down. I chose to find it endearing, rather than maddening. That choice has cost me a certain amount of effort on a recurring basis. The Galactic Council session was scheduled for 6 weeks from the date of Owen's message to his contact. 6 weeks for me to get off the lunar surface and onto a transit vessel, and cover the distance to the council station. 6 weeks for Owen to prepare the archive for presentation in a format that 47 species could access and process. 6 weeks for the Vorath to notice that something was happening. They noticed on day 4. I was on a borrowed cargo transit when Owen sent me the alert. The Vorath had filed a formal preemptive motion with the Council, requesting that any submission of archived human material be reviewed by a joint committee before public presentation, on the grounds that unverified materials from an extinct civilization could constitute a destabilizing influence on galactic diplomatic relations. I read the motion twice. They were not trying to stop the evidence. They were trying to slow it down long enough to have it examined by a committee they controlled. It was smart. I will give them that. It was the move of a species that had been managing the historical record for 400 years and knew exactly which lever to pull. I sent Owen a message. The message said, "How fast can you prepare the full archive for direct broadcast?" He sent back a message that said, "That would be highly irregular." I sent back a message that said, "Owen." He sent back a message that said, 48 hours. Then he sent another message that said, "You are going to present it yourself, are you not?" I did not answer that one. He knew the answer. He had known it, I think, from the moment he found my transmitter code in his tracking data, and understood the kind of person who launches a capsule from a burning building, and then walks out of the building. The council session was in 6 weeks. The Vorath motion would reach the floor in 2. We had 48 hours to build something that a joint Vorath-controlled committee could not contain once it was released. Owen started the clock. I started thinking about what I was going to say when I walked into a room full of 47 species that had watched my world disappear, and decided, on balance, to believe the version of events presented by the people who had made it disappear. I was not going to be polite about it. I was going to be precise. There is a difference, and it matters. And I had 11 months on a burning moon to figure out exactly what that difference was. The Vorath representative's name was Senior Arbiter Davin Kor, and he was very good at his job. I want to say that clearly and without resentment, even though I have a great deal of resentment, because the truth is that watching him work was like watching a machine that had been built for exactly one purpose and had never been asked to do anything else. He was calm, he was precise, he was reasonable in tone and devastating in execution, and he had stood in rooms like the Galactic Council chamber many times before, and he knew how to make a lie sound like the only responsible interpretation of available facts. I was sitting in a side gallery when he began. I was not supposed to be there. The Threnody liaison who had arranged my transit had gotten me into the building on a visitor access code that was technically valid, but had been issued for a purpose that did not include attending formal Vorath presentations on the matter of Earth's self-destruction. Owen was in the main floor section reserved for registered observers, in a seat so close to the edge of the row that I suspected he was managing to be both present and invisible simultaneously, which is a skill I have come to recognize as a core Threnody competency. The chamber was large, the kind of large that is designed to make individuals feel like components of something more significant than themselves, which is the architectural language of institutions that want you to remember you are speaking to history rather than to people. 47 representative seats, arranged in a crescent around the central floor, each seat filled or delegated. 47 species represented in the room where Earth was going to be officially written out of the record. Davin Kor spoke for 2 hours. He had documents. He had timeline projections. He had diplomatic communications from the period in question, showing the Vorath Collective's humanitarian concern for the instability of the human political situation. He had 3 independent analyses from non-Vorath sources, all of which had been produced by institutions that received Vorath funding, though this was not mentioned. He had a visual presentation that showed Earth's final months as a sequence of internal failures, each one documented with what looked like, and very nearly was, complete evidentiary support. He was so good that for the first 40 minutes I caught myself almost believing it. Then Owen stood up. He did not wait to be recognized. He stood up from the observer section, which is not where you stand up from, and he said in the most level voice I have ever heard from a person doing something deeply unauthorized, "Point of order. I have registered materials for submission." There was a pause. The kind of pause that happens in formal institutions when someone does something technically within the rules, in a way that was clearly never anticipated by the rules. The council chair, a senior diplomat from the Adhari collective named Councillor Rain, looked at Owen for a long moment. Then she said, "The observer's submission request is noted. It will be reviewed by the Joint Verification Committee in accordance with the standing motion." This was the move the Vorath had prepared for. I stood up. Not from the observer section, from the visitor gallery. Every head in that chamber turned. I had thought about this moment for 6 weeks. I had prepared for it across 2 transit legs, and a very long wait in a cargo hold, and the 48 hours Owen and I had spent building what we were about to release. I had imagined it in many versions. The version where I was eloquent, the version where I was controlled and precise, and devastating in the measured way of someone who has had a long time to prepare. What happened was that I stood up, and the chamber went very quiet, and I said, "My name is Yara Osei. I am from Accra, Ghana, Earth. My mother made the best groundnut soup you will never taste, and I have 4.7 terabytes of proof that we existed." Then I sat down. The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which in a formal diplomatic chamber is approximately 4 centuries. Davin Kaur spoke first. He was good enough to keep his voice entirely level. He said, "The individual in the visitor gallery has introduced herself as a human survivor. I would like to note for the record that the existence of individual survivors does not contradict the position of the collective, which has maintained consistently that the collapse of Earth's civilization was an internal process, not an external action." He paused. Then he made the mistake. "Furthermore," he said, "any archived materials presented as human cultural record should be subject to verification, as it would be straightforward to fabricate emotional content designed to mimic the texture of a living culture. Anyone with sufficient knowledge of human social patterns could produce materials that appear authentic." He was smart enough to say it carefully. He was not quite smart enough to hear what he had just said. Owen heard it. I heard it. 3 of the 8 council members who had been asking quiet questions for 16 months heard it, and I watched 2 of them sit very slightly forward in their seats. Councillor Rain, to her considerable credit, heard it. She said, "The collective's representative has indicated that fabricating authentic-seeming human cultural material would require, quote, sufficient knowledge of human social patterns. The council would note that this statement implies a level of familiarity with human culture that would require either extensive prior study or extended contact. The collective's official position is that contact with Earth was limited to the period of the civilization's final collapse. The council would appreciate clarification of how the collective's representative acquired sufficient knowledge to evaluate the authenticity of human cultural materials." Davin Kaur had been doing this for a very long time, and he recovered quickly. But quickly is not the same as perfectly. He said, "The collective has maintained cultural intelligence files on all species within the galactic community as a standard diplomatic practice." Councillor Rain said, "When were those files initiated?" Davin Kaur said, "That information is classified under collective internal security protocols." Councillor Rain said, "I see." She did not need to say anything else. The 2 words carried everything they needed to carry, and in a chamber of 47 species, at least 30 of them heard what the 2 words were carrying. Then Owen played the archive. He had not asked for permission after the first request was noted. He had the direct broadcast access that I had arranged through the Threnody liaison, and he used it, and what filled the council chamber's shared audiovisual system was not a political statement, or a military record, or a diplomatic communication. It was a man singing, badly, to his dog. A large and apparently very patient dog who was being sung an improvised song about how he was a good dog, and how his name was Charlie, and how he was the best boy. And did he know that? Did he know he was the best boy? The chamber was silent in a way that I had not heard before in that room. Not the silence of waiting. Not the silence of formal procedure. The silence of 47 species encountering something they did not have a category for. Then Owen played the commencement speech. A high school in Ohio. A teacher named Mr. Ellison who was clearly very nervous and kept clearing his throat. He told the graduating students that the world was going to be harder than they expected, and easier than they feared, and that the most important thing they would ever learn was how to sit with someone else's difficult moment without trying to fix it. He said this twice. He apologized for being emotional. He was clearly emotional. The graduating students were clearly moved by him. This was very clear even across the translation system, which I understood, because translation systems are built for vocabulary and grammar, and they do not catch the thing in a person's voice when they mean something. Then Owen played the brothers. I had not chosen this file. It was his selection, and it was better than anything I would have chosen. Two brothers, arguing about their mother. Which of them she had loved more? Which of them had been her favorite? Which of them had understood her better? The argument was fierce and detailed, and went on for 11 minutes, and at no point was it resolvable by any external standard, because it was not actually about their mother. It was about being known and being seen, and the specific fear of two people who had lost someone, that they would lose each other next, if they could not find a way to agree on what she had meant. At the end of the recording, one of the brothers made a joke. It was not a particularly good joke. The other brother laughed anyway. Then the first brother laughed at the second brother laughing. Then neither of them could stop, and the recording ended with both of them laughing in the way that happens when something that is not funny is still funny, because you are together and you are still here, and you have just spent 11 minutes saying things that needed to be said. Davenport did not speak immediately after the recording ended. This was, in my assessment, the most significant moment in the entire session. Not what he said, what he did not say, and how long he did not say it. When he did speak, he said the recordings were fabrications. He said this clearly and firmly, and in exactly the tone of someone who has made a prepared statement rather than a responsive one, which told me the statement had been prepared before he heard the recordings. You do not prepare a statement calling something a fabrication before you have heard it, unless you already know what it is. You only know what something is if you have seen it. Owen did not need to say this out loud. Councillor Rain did not need to say it out loud. The three council members who had been leaning slightly forward did not need to say it out loud. The logic was in the room. It sat there in the quiet after Davenport's statement, like something solid and immovable. An arbiter who had never seen authentic human cultural materials would not know what authentic human cultural materials looked like. An arbiter who described them as fabrications before examining them, in terms specific enough to identify exactly what they were fabrications of, was an arbiter who had seen exactly these materials before. And a collective that had classified the date of their cultural intelligence initiation was a collective that did not want anyone to calculate how long they had been watching before they acted. I did not give the 22-page speech. There was no point. The speech was designed to build toward a conclusion that the chamber had already reached on its own, sitting in the silence after an 11-minute recording of two brothers who could not agree on who their mother had loved more. I walked down from the visitor gallery to the main floor. No one stopped me, which surprised me slightly. The security protocol for the council chamber was extensive, but I think there are moments when an institution's formal procedures and its sense of what is actually happening in front of it come into brief conflict, and for a few seconds, the people responsible for enforcement are waiting to see which one wins. I stood on the main floor. I said my name again, and where I was from, and what my mother made, not because these things were politically significant, but because they were the first things, and the first things were what mattered. Then I submitted the archive through Owen's broadcast access. Full transmission. Every file. 47 terabytes of unfiltered human record, delivered simultaneously to the individual systems of every representative in the chamber, and logged into the council's permanent record before any motion to suppress or review could be filed. Davenport filed the motion anyway. Councillor Rain acknowledged the motion and noted that as the materials were now part of the permanent council record, the motion to suppress would need to be reviewed against the council's foundational charter regarding the preservation of evidence submitted in active inquiry. She looked at Davenport when she said this. He looked at her. The motion died in committee 3 days later. There were things that happened after that. Procedural things, investigative things, the slow machinery of 47 species trying to collectively decide what they had just learned and what it obligated them to do. That machinery was very slow. It was, at times, almost unbearably slow. But it was moving. And the archive was in it, permanent and logged and impossible to remove. 47 terabytes of human life, in the Council's own record, a 6-year-old's drawing of a dog, alongside the diplomatic communications and the military intelligence, and all the official things that official institutions know how to file. Circa now. I walked out of the chamber and Owen was waiting in the corridor and he had brought food, which was extremely Owen, because he had spent 6 weeks on this transit and was apparently still capable of thinking about lunch. He handed me something wrapped in paper. He said it was a Threnody travel provision that he thought I might find acceptable. He said it with the careful hesitation of someone who has read extensively about human food preferences and is not confident in his practical application of that research. I took it. I ate it. It was not my mother's groundnut soup. But I was hungry, and I was alive, and the archive was in the permanent record, and Davenport was in a closed consultation with the Council's inquiry committee, which was the closest thing to satisfying that the universe was currently offering me. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The Vorath Empire did not collapse. I need to say that at the beginning, because I think there is a version of this story that a person might expect, where the evidence is presented, and the guilty party falls, and justice arrives, in a form clean enough to feel like an ending. I understand why a person might expect that. I expected it myself, in the parts of myself that were still young enough to want the world to be that straightforward. What actually happened was more complicated, and considerably more slow. The Vorath Collective was formally censured by a vote of 31 to 16 in the Galactic Council's emergency session, which occurred 4 months after my testimony. The censure included a mandate for independent investigation into what the Council carefully termed historical record discrepancies, rather than erasure or conspiracy, because the Council is an institution, and institutions prefer language that leaves room for negotiation. The investigation was assigned to a joint committee of 9 species, which did not include the Vorath but did include 2 species that had maintained favorable diplomatic relations with the collective for over a century. 2 Vorath officials were eventually tried. They were mid-level administrators, the kind of people who execute policy rather than create it. The people who created the policy remained in their positions. There was a 15-year trade restriction. There was a formal requirement for the Vorath to submit to cultural transparency audits, which were conducted by a team that the Vorath's legal office had significant input in selecting. I attended one hearing of the investigation committee. I gave my testimony and answered questions for 3 hours from committee members who were mostly asking exactly the right questions in exactly the wrong order, and I left the hearing with the feeling of someone who has successfully completed a task that will need to be done again tomorrow. The survivors found each other slowly. 39 of us, scattered across 4 different Allied stations, each having survived the occupation in ways specific enough to fill their own separate accounts. We were not a unified group. We had not planned to survive together. We had each survived in the particular way our individual situations allowed, and the 39 people who came through were not a cross-section of humanity, but a random collection of whoever had been in the right place in the wrong year, which meant we were, like all random collections, completely ungovernable. We had our first official meeting on a Threnody station 8 months after the council session. It was supposed to be an organizational meeting, establishing a formal body that could represent human interests in the ongoing investigation and reconstruction process. It turned into an argument about the agenda. Not the content of the agenda, the format. 2 of the survivors believed the agenda should be circulated in advance and approved by consensus before the meeting began. 3 survivors believed that circulating the agenda in advance gave people time to form positions before hearing counter-arguments, which biased the discussion. 1 survivor, a former civil engineer from Edinburgh named Callum, believed we should not have a formal agenda at all, and should simply see what needed to be addressed. The woman from Lagos, Amara, who had been a secondary school teacher and had a quality of absolute authority that I recognized from every teacher I had ever feared and respected, told Callum that was the least practical suggestion she had heard since the invasion, and possibly including the invasion. Callum said she was being dramatic. Amara said she had survived 11 months of occupation using a pre-war bicycle and a very large extended family network, and she was allowed to be as dramatic as she liked. Callum laughed. Then Amara laughed. Then we spent another 2 hours arguing about the agenda and did not establish a formal body that day. I sat in the corner and watched all of this, and I thought, there it is. We had survived extinction, and we were already back to being completely ourselves. I have never been more proud of anything in my life, and I include the archive and the council testimony, and every decision I made in the burning relay station. The arguments about the agenda were proof of something the archive had been trying to demonstrate, and that I had not found a way to say in 22 pages of prepared speech. A species that argues about the format of the agenda of a meeting called to address its own extinction is a species that has not, in any meaningful sense, been defeated. You cannot defeat something that is still busy disagreeing with itself. The disagreement is the life. Owen came to the meeting. He sat next to me in the corner, not because he had been invited, but because he had been involved long enough to have accumulated a kind of informal membership that no one had formally granted, and no one was going to revoke. He watched the argument about the agenda with the expression he often wore when observing human behavior, which was the expression of someone taking very fast mental notes. He said quietly, at one point, "Is this productive?" I said, "Yes." He said, "It does not appear productive." I said, "Owen, the fact that we are arguing about our agenda instead of about whether we deserve to have an agenda is the most productive thing that has happened in 14 months. He thought about that for a moment. Then he wrote it down. He was still doing that, writing things down. 17 months into knowing me, and he still encountered things I said that he felt the need to document, which I chose to interpret as a compliment, and Owen would have chosen to interpret as professional habit. The practical work of rebuilding was, as all practical work is, mostly undramatic. The archive became the foundation, not metaphorically, literally. The cultural record I had launched from the relay station, combined with Owen's 12 years of pre-contact documentation, became the primary source material for what the linguistics teams and cultural historians from 6 different species began working on in the months after the council session. There were people who spent the following years doing nothing else but processing and contextualizing the archive, building it into something navigable, something that could be used as the beginning of a reconstruction, rather than simply a record of loss. The archive was also, as it turned out, actively studied by nearly every species in the galactic community in ways that had nothing to do with the Vorath investigation. The Threnody Linguistics Department spent 6 months on the comment sections alone. This is a thing that happened. There were 12 published academic papers. Owen was a co-author on 4 of them. The primary finding of those papers, as Owen summarized it to me in the plainest language he could manage, was that no other species in the documented galactic record had ever maintained a communication practice in which participants knowingly argued positions they did not hold, for the pleasure of the argument, in public forums dedicated entirely to that practice. Other species had disagreement. Other species had debate. Other species had formal adversarial discourse structures with established rules and recognized outcomes. No other species had comment sections. I will not pretend this did not make me, for a brief moment, feel something that was very close to species pride, which is an emotion I normally find somewhat embarrassing. The practical reality of being 39 humans, in a galaxy that was still working out what to do with that information, was that we spent a lot of time waiting for committee decisions, waiting for diplomatic processes to advance, waiting for the Vorath investigation to produce findings that were comprehensive enough to be actionable. The 15-year trade restriction was already in effect, but the deeper question of what accountability actually looked like for an empire that had been rewriting history for 4 centuries was a question the Council was moving toward with all the speed of an institution that had just discovered it was working with entirely inadequate procedural frameworks. I spent a significant part of those months on the Threnody station, partly because it was where the archive processing was centered, and partly because Owen had, by this point, appointed himself my unofficial logistics coordinator without asking if that was something I wanted. It was something I wanted. I did not tell him that immediately, because I had learned that Owen, given clear confirmation that something he was doing was valued, would do 70% more of it than was necessary. The message arrived on a Tuesday. I was reviewing archive indexing work with a Threnody cultural preservation specialist named Lena, who had the particular quality of being very good at her job and very comfortable with silence, which made her excellent company. The message came through on my personal communicator, an encrypted transmission on a frequency I did not recognize from a source I did not have on record. It was coordinates. No text, no identification, just a precise set of spatial coordinates, inside Vorath space, and a signal frequency that I recognized after a few seconds as a human emergency broadcast standard, the kind of frequency that had not been used since the occupation. Someone was transmitting on a human frequency from inside Vorath space. Lena looked at me across the table. She had seen my face change. She said, "Do you need a moment?" I said, "No, I need a ship." Owen appeared in the doorway approximately 40 seconds later, which meant he had been in the corridor when the message arrived, which meant he had almost certainly been monitoring my communications frequency for the last several months, which was a significant invasion of my privacy, and also meant he was already tracking the coordinates on his own system when he walked in. He said, "The signal is on a frequency consistent with the pre-war human emergency broadcast standard." I said, "I know." He said, "The coordinates place the source inside a Vorath classified research facility." I said, "I know." He said, "Entering Vorath space without authorization would be in direct violation of the Council's current investigative protocols." I said, "Owen." He said, "I have sourced a transit vessel. It is technically registered under a Threnody academic research designation that would allow entry into the outer Vorath territories without formal clearance." I looked at him. He looked back at me, with the expression of someone who has thought very carefully about something and arrived at a conclusion they were not entirely comfortable with and had decided to proceed anyway. I said, "When did you source the vessel?" He said, "Approximately 17 minutes ago." He had gotten the message before I did. He had sourced the vessel, computed the approach route, and waited in the corridor for me to finish my meeting before walking in to tell me he was already ready. I said, "You monitored my communications frequency." He said, "I was concerned." I said, "Owen." He said, "I have had the coordinates plotted for 15 minutes. If we leave in the next 6 hours, we can enter the outer Vorath territories before the quarterly patrol rotation." I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. I said, "Let's go. I want to tell you about the smell of the Vorath archive facility, because I think it tells you something important before you know what the facility contains." It smelled like preservation, not like a library, which has a particular dusty warmth to it, a smell of things that have been kept by people who cared about them. This was different. This was the smell of things kept by an institution, the antiseptic cold of storage that is about control rather than care, things locked away, not out of love, but out of the understanding that objects carry proof the way a witness carries testimony, and proof needs to be managed. Owen and I had gotten inside on the Threnody academic designation, with a story about a research survey that was plausible enough to pass a tired outer perimeter guard, and implausible enough that I spent the first 20 minutes inside, expecting someone to ask us a question we could not answer. Nobody did. The outer territories of Vorath classified space were not, it turned out, staffed with their most alert personnel. This made a kind of institutional sense. The outer territories were not where the things that needed guarding were kept. They were where the things that had already been contained were stored. We followed the frequency signal for 11 minutes through corridors that were clean and lit, and exactly as empty as corridors become when an institution believes nothing of value is currently under threat. The door at the end of the signal required a clearance code. Owen had the clearance code. I did not ask how. There are things Owen does not explain, and things I have learned not to ask him to explain, and accessing Vorath classified facility entry codes falls clearly within the second category. The door opened. The room was large, larger than I had expected from the corridor approach, because the facility had been built to look from the outside like a medium-sized administrative storage complex, and from the inside like something that had needed to be hidden inside a medium-sized administrative storage complex. The shelving units were tall, running floor to high ceiling in rows that went deeper than I could see from the entrance. and on each shelf there were storage units, sealed and indexed with Vorath classification codes, thousands of them, arranged with the meticulous organization of people who understood that order is a tool of power. The signal was coming from deep inside the room, a terminal, tucked between two storage rows, transmitting on the human frequency through a connection to the facility's external array that should not have existed, and that I was going to spend considerable time later wondering how it had been established, and by whom. Owen went to the terminal. I went to the nearest shelving row and looked at the classification codes on the storage units. The codes were Vorath Administrative Standard, a system Owen had been working with long enough to read. He moved down the row, scanning codes, his expression shifting in the particular way it shifted when he encountered something that required significant internal recalibration. He said, without turning, "These are not human materials." I said, "What are they?" He said, "This section is indexed to the Kavara civilization." He moved along the row. "This section is Peleth Cultural Archive." He moved further. "This section." He stopped. "This section is Elan." I knew the Elan. Everyone in the galactic community knew the Elan the way you know a story that was finished before you arrived. They had been a major civilization, old and sophisticated, whose dissolution 500 years ago was one of the foundational events of the current galactic order. The official record described a civilization that had collapsed under the weight of internal contradictions, philosophical disputes so fundamental that the species had ultimately fragmented beyond cohesion. The official record had been written by the Vorath. Owen was very still in the way that he became still when something he was looking at required him to completely revise a framework he had held for a long time. He said, "This facility contains the cultural archives of 6 civilizations." I said, "How long have they been here?" He ran the index. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The Elan materials were logged into this facility 462 years ago. 462 years. The Vorath had been doing this for 462 years. Earth was not an experiment. Earth was not an escalation. Earth was a continuation. The machine had been running for 4.5 centuries, and 6 civilizations had been fed through it before us, and the galaxy had been taught to call each disappearance a natural event, a self-inflicted wound, a tragedy of internal failure." I sat down on the floor of the Vorath facility, and I did not move for a long time. Owen sat next to me. He did not say anything. I had spent 1.5 years working toward justice for one civilization. I had sat in the council chamber and said my mother's name and submitted the archive and watched the machinery of 47 species, slowly, imperfectly, begin to turn toward accountability. 7 civilizations. Not 1, 7. I thought about the Elan, about what an Elan might have preserved, if they had known what was coming, what their version of groundnut soup was, what their equivalent of a 6-year-old drawing a dog in crayon and writing circa now might have looked like, whether they had brothers who argued about their mother, whether they had teachers who got emotional giving speeches, whether they had someone sitting in a room somewhere doing what I had done in the relay station, trying to make sure the record survived. I thought about the people who had built this facility, who had collected these archives, who had understood exactly what they were taking and had not destroyed it. Because destroying would have been simpler, and they had not destroyed it. They had preserved it, kept it classified, kept it controlled, but kept it. The instinct that runs counter to erasure, even inside the machine of erasure, the instinct that says this is real, and real things should not simply not exist. The terminal was still transmitting, the human frequency signal, steady and clear. I stood up. Owen stood up. I said, "We cannot take all of this today." He said, "No." I said, "We can document it, record the index, the classification system, the facility location, the entry evidence." He said, "I have been recording since we entered." Of course he had. I said, "This changes the council case." He said, "Yes." I said, "This changes everything." He said carefully, "It changes the scope. The principle has not changed. Evidence is still evidence. Truth is still truth." He said it in the same way he said most things, precise and measured, without the rising inflection that would have made it inspiring. Owen does not do inspiring. He does accurate, and after long enough in his company, I have come to find accuracy more sustaining than inspiration in any case. I went to the terminal, and I opened a direct broadcast channel. Not encrypted. Not narrow beam. Full frequency, the widest transmission array the facility's external connection could support, bounced through the Threnodi relay network Owen had already mapped into our transit approach. The Vorath would detect it in minutes. We had minutes. It was enough. I said my name. I said where I was. I said what the facility contained. The 6 civilizations. The 462 years. The classification codes and the index, and the evidence Owen was still recording as I spoke. I said the location of the facility in coordinates, that any ship with standard navigation could follow. I said that everything I was describing was now in the Threnodi relay network's transmission log, time-stamped and unalterable. I said, the Vorath's mistake was not underestimating human military capability. It was assuming that a species capable of losing could be made to disappear. We are not a species that disappears. We are a species that writes things down, and we are not the first. And the ones who came before us also wrote things down. And those things are in this building, and this building is at these coordinates. And the truth of every civilization that was ever fed through this machine is now in the transmission log of a relay network that 47 species can access. Then I said something I had not planned to say. I said, I am not angry at you for believing them. I understand what it is to be told a clean story, and find it easier than the alternative. We believed clean stories too. We believed them until we couldn't. The difference between us and the Vorath is not that we never got something wrong. The difference is that when we get something wrong, we argue about it until we get it right. So let's argue. I said that last part specifically for Owen, who was standing 3 feet away recording everything, and who looked at me with the expression he had when he did not know whether to be deeply moved or deeply exasperated, and was managing both simultaneously. Then I closed the broadcast channel. Owen said, we should leave now. I said, yes. We walked back through the clean-lit corridors of a facility that had been built to make things disappear, and had failed, in the end. Not because of an army or a weapon or a political revolution, but because of a terminal, transmitting on a frequency that someone had left running, and 2 people who followed the signal, and a relay network that would carry what we had found before anyone who wanted to stop it could close the channel. We got to the transit vessel with 7 minutes to spare before the Vorath perimeter alert activated. Owen started the departure sequence. His hands moved across the controls with the efficiency of someone who has spent the approach time planning the exit, because of course he had. I sat in the co-pilot seat and watched the facility grow small behind us and then disappear into the dark. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up a wrapper from the travel provisions he had brought for the approach journey, a Threnodi snack I had tried once and found acceptable, and he looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone examining something that does not quite fit his existing categories. He said, slowly, was all of that strictly necessary? I thought about the relay station, about 11 months of being the last, about a 6-year-old who wrote "Circa Now" in crayon, and did not know she was writing the title of a story that would outlast everything she had ever been afraid of losing. I thought about the Elan, 462 years in a classified storage unit, waiting for someone to follow a signal. I thought about Owen, monitoring my communications frequency and sourcing a transit vessel, and sitting next to me on the floor of that facility, without saying anything, because he had learned, slowly, to know when not to say anything. I thought about 39 people arguing about the format of an agenda on a Threnodi station, in a meeting about rebuilding a species, arguing in the way that means we are still here, still disagreeing, still absolutely impossible, still completely ourselves. I said, yeah. The transit vessel moved into open space. The stars did what they always do, which is hold their positions with complete indifference to everything that happens between them, all the civilizations that rise and fall and get filed in classified facilities and get found again by people following signals in the dark. I said, it was. Owen nodded. He put the wrapper down carefully in the disposal slot. He did not write anything down this time. He did not need to. The transmission log had everything.